Audrey, the proportion of the population living in rented accommodation and the number of people per rental unit are at record highs, and vacancy rates are razor thin, meaning rental inflation will be with us for the foreseeable future, according to a new report on the private rental sector from Savills. The author of the report, John McCarthy, Director of Research at Savills, is with us now in studio. Good morning, John.
Hi, Conor.
Just on that point of rental property household size, so your analysis indicates that the number of people per unit is actually on the rise due to the scarcity of units available.
Indeed, yeah. The number of persons in the average privately rented household was pretty steady for 10 years until the start of 2016, and since then we've seen it increase quite sharply. And I think a reasonable interpretation of that is that, look, there's just such a scarcity of rental properties available. We estimate that the vacancy rate is 1.3%, that people are having to club together, and of course costs come into it as well. We all know that rents now are higher than they were back in the boom, and this means that people are trying to club together to make the rent. And what we're seeing is that maybe 18 months ago, in a two-bedroom apartment, maybe you would have had one couple in there and they would have had the spare room for visitors or storage. Today they're moving into a one-bedroom apartment, and who's going into the two-bedroom unit? It's two couples with four incomes making the rent.
In terms of the vacancy rate, you mentioned it there at 1.3%. There's no getting away from supply and demand, unfortunately, here. The equilibrium vacancy rate, so the rate at which you'd expect that rents would stabilise, is about 5.6%.
Indeed, and what that really tells us is that we're going to have to do just an enormous amount of construction before we get rents or indeed house prices stabilising. At the moment, house building activity is picking up, but it's coming from such a low base that I think it's going to be 3 to 5 years at least before we really start matching supply and demand.
What are your projections then for rental inflation over that sort of time frame while we're waiting for supply to catch up?
Well, it depends what part of the country you're in, Conor. If you're in one of the rent controlled areas, then I think realistically we're looking at rent inflation of somewhere slightly north of 5%. So the rent controls within those RPZs limit annual rental increases to 4%, but of course any new buildings or properties that previously weren't rented in the past 2 years that come onto the market can be set to market rates. So on a weighted average basis you'll be getting 5 to 6% rental growth there. Elsewhere in the country where rents aren't controlled and they're coming from a very low base, I think we'll see rental increases of 7.5%.
One of the things that your analysis also shows here is that there appears to be a trend where cash investors are squeezing out the traditional debt-financed buy-to-let landlords that we would have seen in the past.
Yeah, indeed. The sector has been notoriously under-regulated and standards have been very poor, and thankfully, that is now being addressed. But one of the side effects of that is it's increasing the costs of operating an investment property for investors. And that means that investors that have a high level of gearing, typically anything more than 40% loan-to-value mortgages, are finding it very, very difficult to get a profit from renting residential property. So they're being squeezed out. But the good news, I think, is that cash investors, and there's plenty of them, can make a very good profit at this. If you look at the yield that's available to investors across Dublin, 4.5% net, compared with deposit rates which are 0.5%. So they're piling in and they're forcing out the mortgaged ones. But the critical thing to say is that, look, in general the sector is growing, so we shouldn't be trying to protect these mortgaged investors. They've got a failing business model because their cost base is too high, and we should just let the cash investors drive them out.
So tax breaks not necessarily the answer there, according to you, John McCarthy, Director of Research at Savills. Thanks for coming into us this morning. In currency news, the euro buys 88.2 pence sterling and 1